I mentioned in the last video that the first Reformation Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, was massively influential in advancing the priorities of the Reformation while retaining an emphasis on the Catholic tradition which is received. Cranmer was also responsible for the production of two major artifacts which have decisively shaped all of Anglicanism from that time to the present. The first of these that I'm going to talk about in this video is the Book of Common Prayer. And in the next video, I'll talk about the second artifact, which is the 39 Articles. So first, the Book of Common Prayer. Wherever Anglicanism has gone, it is always worshipped according to the Book of Common Prayer. One of the foremost students of the Book of Common Prayer is a scholar named Charles Hefling. And here's what he says about it. It was Winston Churchill who observed that we shape our buildings, and afterwards our buildings shape us. The same is true of liturgies. Using the Book of Common Prayer has been a species of religious training or spiritual formation for those Christians who since 1549 have worshipped in and as the churches known today as Anglican. So everywhere Anglicanism has gone, the Book of Common Prayer has also gone, and it's been translated into many different idioms, to many different cultural contexts, using many different expressions, cultural expressions. And so the book itself is not sacrosanct. It's very revisable. But as a document, it has been massively influential as a tradition of shaping people in a way of spiritual formation, in a way of following Jesus. So what is the Book of Common Prayer? Where does it come from? When you were a priest in Latin Christianity in the medieval West, what you would have to do in order to celebrate the Mass or to pray daily prayer or anything else, you had to have many different books, and they were all in Latin and of varying quality. And so what Thomas Cranmer did was, and this was his genius, was to take all of those books and to put them in one place and to reform all of them according to Scripture and to add tons and tons and tons of Scripture so that to worship was actually an act of immersion in the Holy Scriptures themselves, and then to translate the whole thing into English. Now, the early Christians took over the practice of praying what was called fixed hour prayer from the Jews. The Jews would gather for prayer at various points during the day. You can see this reflected in the scriptures, actually. If you read the book of Acts, you'll see that the Jews would gather to pray at the temple or at the synagogue at the third hour or the sixth hour or the ninth hour. That refers actually to these hours of prayer where they would gather to pray liturgically. And to pray liturgically simply means to pray specific prayers that are set at specific times and in a specific way with a gathered congregation of people. During the medieval period, Christians actually kind of stopped gathering in this way for prayer, but who retained it were the monks. The monks continued to pray in this way. They continued to pray fixed hour prayer throughout the whole medieval period. Cranmer knew this tradition of the early church, and he wanted to see it restored. And so when he created the Book of Common Prayer, that word common accentuates what his priority was. It was to get the church praying in common together again. So in the introduction to the first Book of Common Prayer, he says that all priests and deacons should be praying the daily office either privately or openly every day. And openly just means in the church with a gathered company of people to be praying it with him. And communion was never to be celebrated privately. It was always to be celebrated with the whole community of the faithful gathered and communing with the priest. So if there was going to be a communion service, there would always have to be communicants. This priority of praying in common was critical for Cranmer, and again, it's a priority that he took over from the early church. Now, this word daily office that I just said, what is that? What Cranmer saw was that there was a proliferation of these prayer services. And so in order to make it possible for the community to pray together, what he did was to take the ones that were prayed in the morning and combine them all into a single service, which was called morning prayer, and then to take all the ones in the afternoon and early evening and combine them into a single service, which was called evening prayer. These two prayer services were called the daily office. And so this has been a critical feature of every Book of Common Prayer from its inception until the present day. Now, there's been many different prayer book revisions. There was a revision, the initial volume came out in 1549. There was a revision in 1552, and then 1559, and then 1603, and then in 1662. And so this prayer book has been revised many, many different times. When the American church took shape in 1789, they created their own prayer book. The Scottish Episcopal Church created its own prayer book. And every province that has come into being since the inception of the Anglican Communion, has created its own prayer book, and that's been a critical priority for every church. What this means, though, is that although there is a tradition of prayer books, and all of them have the same format, all of them contain the daily office, all of them contain the Eucharist, all of them contain pastoral rites like funerals and a rite for confession, a rite for administration to the sick, and so on. And they contain an ordinal, they contain a psalter, they contain resources related to the scripture lectionary, which are the readings that are appointed for all the different services. Every prayer book has the same format, and yet every prayer book has slightly different theological or cultural priorities that it expresses. And this is part of the brilliance of Anglicanism, is that there is a cultural diversity that's expressed within the different prayer books, even as the prayer books form a coherent tradition in and of themselves. So Cranmer's great gift, one of his bequests to the Anglican Church, has been this Book of Common Prayer, which has guided and governed worship ever since its inception. Every service that we perform here or we celebrate here at Ascension is governed by this prayer book. Although you'll receive a bulletin that lays out the service, that service is derived from our Book of Common Prayer. And the most recent prayer book revision, which the Anglican Church in North America uses, is the Book of Common Prayer from 2019. So that is the prayer book which our services are drawn from. So every Sunday when you're here, just remember, you're participating in a lengthy tradition that goes really all the way back to the medieval period of worshiping according to this prayer book.